I'm Shriti Patel. I'm a student, and I'd like to know how IFPRI views the role of the private sector, specifically agribusiness, in stemming the current price crisis.
Hi, Patrick Laprousse with the European Commission. Just wondering if you could quickly comment on the impact of index speculators on commodities futures contracts and the role of that in the increase in the food prices globally, and if you have any prescriptions for how to deal with that.
I'd like to bring back the dimension of immediacy to this crisis. I certainly appreciate the magnitude of the effort, and particularly in terms of short-term impact we are trying to do through the transfers and the immediate relief assistance that are being provided. Some of those programs we've been talking about, for instance, seeds and tools and subsidies for farmers to help them face the oncoming their capital and so on. I was in Haiti 3 weeks ago, and the same kind of discussions were taking place. However, it was clear at that point that by the 15th of May, if the seeds had not been distributed, it was no point distributing seeds anymore. The season was gone. If we had seeds even, the hurricanes of last year, Noel particularly in November, destroyed the productive infrastructure. Basically, the irrigation is completely sedimented, and we needed to rehabilitate that before being able to do any increase in production. I think that those points are immediate issues, and we need to address them now. However, the safety net that we are promoting, I'm asking whether they are well targeted in the first place. We're talking about providing school children with support, providing the vulnerable with support, providing pregnant and lactating mothers with support. And for the farmers, we're providing seeds, but those seeds are not going to be very useful in Haiti right now. I think I fully understand that IFPRI cannot look at every country, as was said earlier. However, there are some things that we need to put the light on. Timing is a very important issue in the short term. We have to consider that. Also, I think that we need to be more effective in linking our relief action to our long-term or longer-term developmental action, the development to relief continuum, if we wish. And I haven't seen that really put forward in the discussion so far.
Hi, this is Emmy Simmons in the library, Partnership to Cut Hunger and Poverty in Africa. I wanted to see if Mark could perhaps address the sort of assumptions that lie behind the bottom line recommendation that was made for $15 to $20 billion a year, whether that's additional, whether that's official development assistance, whether it includes, as one of the colleagues here asked, private investment. I think that when the G8 actually sits down to talk to each other, they will be talking about ODA. But I think what's more important about the current crisis is that it has engaged a number of leaders of developing countries, and they should be participating in that sort of what is the right number. Is it the 10% of government budgets in Africa? Is that going to be enough? Or sort of what are the assumptions that you're making here? Because I think that bottom line really gives a little hook for people to move forward in terms of thinking about appropriate level of response.
Missy Ryan from Reuters. I'd like to ask the panelists to expand, if you would, on the U.S. response as a economic and agricultural leader so far in terms of the humanitarian assistance and the agricultural development. And on trade liberalization, certainly we're a country that provides a lot of food aid, and we're an active player in the Doha negotiations, but you also think about some of the aid procurement rules that we have and the Farm Bill, for example.
John Pender from IFPRI. My question is also on the U.S. Farm Bill. I've heard precious little in this whole discussion in the press and so on about the relationship of this to the U.S. farm policies, even though we're in the middle of a Farm Bill debate. So I wonder if the panel has any comments about the provisions of the Farm Bill, are they favorable? Are they helpful at all? The only thing I've heard about is a small reduction in the ethanol subsidy. Is that enough to help, or should more be done?
Lan Lei from Vietnam Embassy. Do you think that something should be done about the oil price? It seems there are very strong correlation between food and oil price, in which the oil price plays very important role in the recent increases of the food price. So do you think that something should be done about that? And second question is, how much do you think that the prices of food would be reduced, taking account all the plan of action being implemented as you have proposed? There has been opinion that food price can decrease about 50% at the end of this year if all the export restrictions and ban lifted and food production remain at the current level. Do you think that forecast is justified?
Evan Mangino, the U.S. Foreign Agricultural Service. I was wondering if any of your panelists would be able to comment on what role they feel the current food crisis will have in the ongoing GMO debate and the opposition to genetically modified organisms in certain parts of the world.
For the question from Emmy, the $15 to $20 billion is public investments from all sources. It's incremental to our estimated current levels of investment in the following items: agriculture, research, rural roads, irrigation, and clean water, and secondary education as a proxy for human capital development. So it is including the needed expenditures from national governments as well as ODA, but it does not include private investments, which then moves directly into the agribusiness and GMO debate. Obviously, a huge amount of research in the agriculture, funding for agriculture research, it has been in the private sector. The debate over GMOs, I think, has been partly polarized by the fact that the perception that the kinds of products being generated through those investments are not of direct benefit to developing country farmers, and I think that's also a debatable prospect when you see some of the successes, for example, in BT cotton and elsewhere. It seems that there may be some opening now towards a more receptive look at GMO technology in several countries in Africa, in terms of some speeding up of passing of biosafety regulations and laws that are at least open to careful commercial testing and safety. But it's a little bit too soon to tell how that will play out. It looks like also that what could be a breakthrough would be the next generation of GMO technologies. If a successful drought-tolerant maize, for example, can be generated and adapted for African and conditions and poorer areas, poorer soil conditions and poorer environments in Asia, that I think would also be a major change in perceptions, which also links to the overall aspect of agribusiness. And Joachim, you may want to talk a little bit about the issues on possible concentration internationally from agribusiness in the supermarkets and other sectors. I think the role of agribusiness could be enhanced tremendously if a successful negotiation could be to get licensing fees and transfer arrangements to get the best technology to African and poor Asian farmers, perhaps at somewhat reduced royalty rates, for example, that would enhance the acceptability and the impact on small farmers. I think that's going to be an essential role also there. So there has to be some give in that direction as well. On the farm policy, John, the 6% drop in the subsidy will have no impact on anything really. That was not a useful policy. There would have to be significant additional reductions in the subsidies and tariffs to make any impact on that. So that farm bill has not really been responsive to the current crisis from what I've seen of it, certainly in those aspects.
I just want to add on the agribusiness part. I think that it's very important to notice that the areas where you can increase more productivity, which is what you need right now, is where smallholders are, because large holders normally are in the frontier. So if you want to jump, you have to move to smallholders, and that's where the private sector could play a significant role through agribusiness and vertical and horizontal coordination. And the reason is simple, is because in high-value crops, the products are differentiated, and that's what the companies are looking for. So the smallholders provide the different qualities and standards at different points in time, which they need to sell in this very thin market. So agribusiness could play a significant role. We have seen some cases of reaction in the sense that they know that if their farmers, the small farmers, don't put the type of fertilizers and conditions they need to get the output to be able to export it, they're trying to support them through collaterals for microfinance institutions. So there is a big role to play there. The second comment on the impact of index trade and future speculators. As I mentioned in the presentation, we still cannot argue that there is a share of that non-explained difference in the price to what the fundamentals are telling and to what the trade barriers could be explaining, that we can argue directly that this is speculation. But what we know is that there is something going on, and we are trying to disentangle that. There is a team led by Miguel Robles trying to work on that in IFPRI. But what we know is that there are measures that are standard where you have thin markets that can be applied. And that's why we were talking about the idea of coordinating reserves, in the sense that when there is an increase of price over a certain price band, which is moved by the fundamentals, then the reserves can be released and you can have a reduction in the price. Something similar to what happened in rice when Japan releases the reserves 1 week ago, 2 weeks ago. It's so thin the market that a release of reserves from Japan immediately reduced the international price. On the U.S. Farm Bill, I agree. Basically, what it is to keep the option open for the farmers, so there is no change that really reacts to what is happening in the international market. I assume John will expand on the issue that Joaquin was mentioning. On the oil price, this idea that it could be affecting, as it has been mentioned before, now we have a different formula for agriculture because of the biofuels. But if we just look to the oil price and the effect over fertilizers and inputs for agriculture, the traditional effect, we see a significant increase. There are significant increases in developing countries on 50% or more of fertilizers access, which of course reduce their capacity to be able to react to the increase in international prices. Now, how strong is that correlation? It's very difficult to measure. Our team here has been trying to identify by the trend in the trends how big was the correlation, and you have some erratic. So there is other components moving behind. And of course, modeling the oil price market is a complex issue because it's also a concentrated market. But the point I want to make that in difference to oil and to metals, we are talking of food here, so which is affecting directly the lives of people. So we need to be very careful in this market, and that justifies the idea of bringing some regulatory measures, which of course are market oriented.
Several issues. First of all, that of food aid, both in the United States and internationally. The announcement by President Bush to increase or provide additional support to U.S. food aid is, of course, something which is highly welcome. But the continued restrictions on the use of U.S. funds, particularly restrictions with regard to procurement and shipping, clearly have the effect of making those funds far less effective than they would be otherwise. And in this context, it's important to note that currently the United States lags far behind global best practice in terms of the procurement and use of food aid as a result of these restrictions. Internationally, there is a treaty called the Food Aid Convention, which stipulates minimum commitments that a number of major grain producers will provide in the form of food aid to poor countries. This treaty is obscure and operates with little transparency or monitoring or oversight. The fact that such a treaty exists, that may be a surprise to a number of you in the room, speaks to the lack of transparency with which it functions. Historically, shipments of food aid under the convention have run roughly twice the level of existing commitments. But those shipping levels have fallen every year since the year 2000 and are now only something like 20% above the low level of minimum commitments involved in the convention itself. It's also the case the current convention, which was signed in 1999, has a series of provisions which effectively provide disincentives to the appropriate use of food aid. And these fall into two particular areas, one of which is a lack of recognition of the costs of shipping food, so that in terms of countries to meet their commitments, it makes more sense to ship it to easily accessible locations than to inaccessible remote locations where in fact the need may be greatest. Second, with the better understanding we have now of the causes of malnutrition, it's clear to us that one of the most cost-effective ways of improving nutritional status, particularly of children, is through the provision of micronutrients in a number of forms. And the current convention is structured in such a way that it provides a remarkably strong disincentive to actually provide those micronutrients. I'd also like to speak briefly to the issues that Gilles Bergeron raised. I think one important point to note in terms of the issue of immediacy, and one which also speaks to the concerns raised by Tom Marchione, is that there is one way in which, in fact, this crisis is different from past ones. And that is that many countries have some form of social safety net or forms of social protection already in place. Albeit in many countries they're imperfect, in many countries their coverage is limited. But these, where they do exist, are programs and interventions which can be built on rapidly. And that provides one source of immediacy. Second, while there are costs associated with waiting, with taking time to develop appropriate interventions, and it's true that those costs can be large, it's also the case that getting it wrong the first time also carries very high costs. One of our experiences looking past over the last 30 or 40 years in areas of food policy is, for example, once urban food subsidies are in place, they are extraordinarily difficult to get rid of. And in the longer term, these also carry very high costs in terms of distortions, both for incentives for both producers and consumers. And finally, we like to feel, in terms of this package of proposals that we put forward, is that we are trying to link what you describe as the relief to development continuum, both by proposals which focus on emergency responses and also those which are more longer term and what we describe as being part of the resilience package.
Mm-hmm. Let me add maybe a few remarks selectively and then come to closure. I think it's important for the price story in the future to keep in mind that the cost of agriculture have vastly increased. And it's difficult today to produce a ton of wheat for less than $200 in many locations in the world. So you want to push the production frontiers. World agriculture is in a cost constraint. That will have an impact on your question, sir, regarding how far will prices come down if the higher authorities do all the things which we are proposing in a good and coherent way. Would that be able to cut prices by 50% by the end of this year? I don't think so. The emergency packages has a component of get rid of the export bans, and Maximo Torero says we get 30% out of that, and moratorium stops the biofuels. Mark Rosgan says 30% out of that. Ceteris paribus, you cannot add those up easily, and both are very bold proposals. If we get half of these, well, I would be happy. Then we could probably get down from the peaks where we are currently by, say, 30% in real market effects, and that would leave to get some air out of the bubble, and therefore also reduce the speculation. But that would probably the most we could expect from those packages. That's why the investment in the social protection and emergency humanitarian side is so important. We don't. There's not a bubble which you can peak open very quickly and get back to normal. We have fundamental real issues of lack of productivity and now high costs of agricultural production, which will drive prices for quite some time. A second comment I would like to make is the U.S. response to the current situation. I think the U.S. response on the humanitarian and development aid side was quite appropriate and surprisingly strong. but the US response on the agricultural legislation addressing domestic farming and its externalities leaves a lot to desire. I don't want to add to commentaries in The Economist of this week on the US Farm Bill. I share that opinion. But I think we also need to revisit the energy bill, not just the Farm Bill, which stipulates excessive expansion of biofuel production. And it focuses on the well-being of corporations and of farmers, but it neglects the well-being of poor people. That needs revisiting. And, but I'm quite optimistic that that response is in the making. If we look at the sort of the tone in the hearings, in the Senate hearings the last 2 weeks, in which also IFPRI colleagues presented, a change of mindset has already evolved.